I'm Presley Buttler, and I'm comparing how different light sources affect the growth of Phaseolus vulgaris. Question: how do different light sources affect the growth of Phaseolus vulgaris? I really wanted to do this experiment because our family grows green beans and we have access to a greenhouse, and I was curious to see if in our greenhouse we would grow more green beans per plant if we grew them under UV light versus under a shade cloth. And so that's what this experiment does. The purpose of conducting this experiment was to see which light source Phaseolus vulgaris would thrive under, because some vegetables like tomatoes and green peppers and like acidic vegetables grow best under a shade cloth with restricted light, while other vegetables like peas and green beans grow best under UV light. Knowing the best place to grow will result in better yields of the beans they produce, saving money, space, and reducing the number of plants needing to be grown. Hypothesis: I think that the plants under the UV lights will grow best and produce the most beans. I also think that the UV lights will enhance the growth of plants and make them grow at a much faster rate than normal. The plants beneath the shade cloth will likely produce the least amount of beans. Materials: for this experiment, you will be needing 9 8-inch pots to plant your beans in, potting soil, 9 Phaseolus vulgaris seeds, UV lights to grow under, a shade cloth to grow under, a hose/watering source, and a ruler to measure the growth of your beans. Procedure: fill your pots with potting soil, leave about a 2-inch space at the top for watering. Create a small hole about an inch deep in the middle of each pot. Make sure not to make your hole too deep, otherwise, the bean will start to grow, but then it'll run out of energy to grow before it reaches to the top to get sunlight, and then you won't ever have any results of your beans. And then place the seed in the hole and cover it back up with soil. Move 3 pots to each location, under the shade cloth, under the grow lights, and under natural light. Water each pot once a day and give each plant as much water as they want. This could vary between plants because like the plants under the shade cloth won't want as much water as the plants under the grow light because they aren't being dried out as fast, so they don't like get watered as much. Then measure the plant's growth with a ruler once a week until the growth starts to decline. Make sure you measure the same thing on each plant and make sure you measure them on the same day, otherwise your results will vary. And compare which plants are growing better to decide which light they grow best under. Variables. The independent variables of this experiment are the plants growing under the grow lights and the plants growing under the shade cloth, because that's what we're comparing. And then the dependent variables of this experiment is the height of each plant, because that's what we're measuring, and how many beans each plant produces. The controls of this experiment are the plants in the natural light, because that's what we're comparing, the ones under the shade cloth and the ones under the grow lights, to see if they grow more or less than the ones being grown normally. The constants of this experiment are the same types of seeds was planted in each pot. The soil that we used to pot was the same, and the size of the pot that we used was the same. I measure them and record all the data at the same time each week, and they're all kept in the same conditions in the greenhouse despite the differences in the lights that they get. Charts or graphs. So this graph is the graph of the grow lights. It follows the growth of the plants over about a month span. So I grew 3 plants from seed to full grown and completely under grow lights. These plants grew the fastest, largest, and produced the most and biggest beans. The stems were thick and strong and branched out the most. They also sustained themselves the longest and were the last to wilt or die. The plants under the UV lights exceeded the plants in any other spot by far, and they were obviously the ones that produced the most and biggest beans. This is the chart for the shade cloth, and it follows them over the same span of time. I grew 3 plants completely under a shade cloth, which is a cloth that is hung along the greenhouse ceiling that restricts sunlight. These plants were small, weak, and never produced beans. They wilted easily, and they started to catch this disease at the end of their lifespan, and their leaves were starting to get white. And I think it's because they weren't getting enough sunlight and they were just super unhealthy, and they started to wilt really early, and they never produced beans, and I think it's just because they didn't have the sunlight and the energy needed to do so. Charts and graphs for the control. These were the ones for the plants that were grown normally under the light. For the control group, I grew 3 plants normally in the greenhouse under no special or restricted light. These plants were thinner and not as strong as the ones under the grow lights. Like the ones under the grow lights branched out and had really thick stems and a bunch of beans, and they were like almost big bushes. And the ones in like natural light, they like were long and skinny and they didn't like hold themselves up as well. They also didn't produce as many or as big of beans, but they did produce beans compared to the ones under the shade cloth. They were like, yeah, a little taller, but had less branches. Results. After allowing all the plants to grow as much as they were going to, it was obvious that the plants under the shade cloth were deprived of sunlight. They got sick and they wilted really easily and never resulted in any beans. They grew very weak and never produced any beans. They started to wilt and die prematurely. The plants growing in natural light grew at an adequate rate. They were thinner and taller than the plants under the grow lights. These plants did produce beans, they were just smaller than the ones under the grow lights. The plants under the grow lights exceeded my thoughts of how they were going to turn out. They grew like crazy and produced a lot of beans. They didn't grow as tall as the regular ones, but their stems were much thicker and stronger and they branched out more. Conclusion. The information collected will be extremely helpful in the future when growing vegetables. The results we got will save space and money because we can produce the same amount of beans with less plants. The hypothesis that the plants under the UV lights will grow the best and produce the most beans proved to be true. I will definitely continue this experiment with other vegetables to see if I will get the same results with different types of vegetables. Application. The research I've done will help not only myself and my family, but also others who are interested in growing crops like green beans. Avid gardeners may also find this information useful along with our greenhouse at school. Bibliography. Okay, that concludes my presentation. I now take this time to answer any questions from you guys. Thanks.